Hello, today I'll be presenting What is this URL's destination, an empirical evaluation of users' URL reading. This is work done by my student Sara, Albakry, myself, Dr. Vaniea, and my colleague Maria Wolters, all at the University of Edinburgh. So the main central thesis of this presentation is about URLs and whether or not people can read them. So if you take a look at the URL in front of you, it goes facebook.mobile.com. So you might look at it and go, okay, does this go to Facebook? Does this go to mobile? Where will this go? And so the main point of this research is understanding whether or not an average internet user is capable of answering this question and whether they are able to answer it accurately. In case you're curious, the answer is that this does not go to Facebook. It goes to something called mobile. And I know that because URLs are written in a very similar way to postal addresses. So postal addresses put the most precise thing, like the flat number or the city, at the front, and the least precise large object, like the country or the state, at the back. So facebook.mobile.com doesn't go to Facebook because it goes to something called mobile. And then inside of something called mobile, there might be something called Facebook, though not because I made this URL up. Confusing this is somewhat similar to confusing Edinburgh, Indiana with Edinburgh, Scotland. Even though they both contain the word Edinburgh, they go to very different places. And this is important because URLs are frequently featured in scams. So the email you see here is a scam. It's claiming to be from the UK tax service, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. It doesn't come from the tax service. It's definitely a scam. And I can tell that because I can look at the URL. So if you look at this URL, it starts with HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. So it's trying to suggest that it really is coming from the government. And this bit of it really does look like the government email or URL. But if you take a look at the back part, you realize actually this goes to Paradise Travel Incorporated. And that maybe is not where I'd want to go in order to get a tax return. And this is a very common approach with scams. These are all URLs that do not go to PayPal. But if you look at them, most of them feature the name paypal.com in them. And they're clearly designed to make it look as if these are legitimate PayPal websites when they are not. So the main point here is we want to figure out whether or not these scams would likely be effective. Or more classically, can people accurately predict where a URL will go? Because one of the most common pieces of advice we give to end users on how to protect themselves online is to put their mouse over any links in an email and see whether or not that link leads to where they expect it to go. So is this your bank? Is this Facebook? So we want to know, can people accurately predict where a URL will go? And existing research tells us that really people are not very good at this, particularly when you look at complex URLs and whether or not people can predict whether something is or is not a phishing URL, which means that for this research, we're actually narrowing that question a little bit. So we want to know not only can people accurately predict if a URL, whether or not a URL is phishing, we want to know whether or not they can accurately predict whether a URL will go in a best case scenario. So if they're looking at a fairly clean URL that's not overly complicated, that's not trying to trick them actively, can they predict where it will lead? So can they read URL structures? So in order to do this, we ran a survey where we tested a large number of URLs. In order to create that best case type environment, we focused on a couple different things. So first off, we made sure all the URLs contained HTTPS. It is now possible for anyone to get an HTTPS certificate, including the scammers. So we just do that for consistency. Similarly with .com, again, easy to obtain. We did that for consistency. All the URLs we use are based on an actual URL of a real company. So for example, mobile.cnn.com. CNN.com is a legitimate URL and is the real one for this company. Similarly, paypal.profile.com is not a real URL, but it is based on paypal.com. So in order to do this, we tested 4 domain structures: domain only, single subdomain, and short and complicated. Domain only obviously is something similar to Microsoft, but there's only a singular domain within the URL. Single subdomain means we added a subdomain, so something in front of the domain, and we only added one. Short is things like bit.ly, and complicated URLs are ones where we use 2 different company names when constructing the URL, so similar to twitter.com/facebook.com. The majority of our questions are on single subdomains. We further broke down that into several different components. So we looked at 3 sectors: social media, finance, and news. And we also looked at how recognizable the company that we'd selected was. So was it a well-known company, or was it relatively unknown? And then finally, we also balanced against 2 filler words. We used mobile and profile to fill in the subdomain or the domain component for the URLs to construct a single subdomain. For the methodology, we showed every participant 23 URLs, 3 domain, 12 subdomain, 4 short, 4 complex. And for each one, we showed them a pair of questions, similar to what you see on the right. So on the top, we showed them a URL, and this was shown as an image. Next, we showed them a question about where the URL will go. So we said, if you were to type in the link above into the web browser, what website would open? And we showed them a randomly ordered set of options. We included both elements of the URL. So we have Profile's website and Travel Buddy's website. We also gave 2 options for a URL not being on the list, a website which is not listed here, and redirects to another website with a longer link. And then finally, we included a nonsense answer, in this case, Google's website, because this obviously does not go to Google. We also asked a safety question, but I'm not going to focus on that in this presentation. For participants, we recruited off of both Mechanical Turk and Prolific Academic and got just under 2,000. They are slightly more often male, so 52% male, an average age of 34. 83% are native English speakers, which makes sense since Prolific Academic involves a lot of speakers from across Europe. And then 41% had a college education. So for results, I'm going to go through all 4 of those structures one by one and just explain them to you. So first off, for domain only, we're focusing on Microsoft.com and Google.com. Another one was shown, but I'm not going to use that in our results. 92.7% were able to correctly predict both URLs' destinations. So we were able to say where they go. This is encouraging. It does mean that people can predict fairly basic URLs. For single subdomain, we divided participants actually into 2 different groups. So if you look at the top domain on the list here, facebook.profile.com, one group saw it the way it's presented here, and the other one saw the company name and the filler word swapped. So the other group would have seen profile.facebook.com. We did this to test all different URL structures while ensuring that every single participant only saw each company once within the single subdomains. Here, 8.3% of participants were able to consistently answer with the domain, which is the correct answer. This is kind of terrifying because that means that a very large percentage can't accurately, consistently answer questions like this. And if we break it down, we can start better understanding why. So we showed them 12 questions. 6 of them had the company's name in the domain and 6 in the subdomain. So if we look at only those with the domain, and we look at the number of questions that were answered correctly for each participant, we see that when the company name is in the domain position, people tend to get this right. So when looking at profile.facebook.com or mobile.paypal.com, participants are able to accurately say this goes to Facebook, this goes to Profile, and they do that consistently. Now, when we move the company name into the subdomain position, things change drastically. Almost no one gets it correct. And when you start looking at why, you realize that the majority of them are still giving the company name as the answer. And so, as a side effect, they get the question wrong. Though it is encouraging to see that there is a small increase at the 6th level, which is the people that are able to consistently answer with the correct answer because they know how to read a URL. But that is not what most people are doing. Also, it's not very different based on our various controls. So we controlled for things like company, how well they're known, and what area they're in, such as finance. And it really doesn't matter. The graph you're seeing here is looking only at the cases in which the URL was in the subdomain position. And you see that only about between 20 and 30% of the time were participants able to correctly identify that where this URL would go. And that is somewhat discouraging in terms of fraud and spam, because it means that a lot of people, thinking back to those PayPal URLs I showed you, would incorrectly think that those actually went to Facebook when they do not, or to PayPal when they do not. Next, short URLs. So we showed them 4 short URLs. 2 of them were from fairly well-known companies and 2 of them were from fairly not very well-known companies. Short URLs are really hard to understand. Even an expert would really struggle to correctly tell you the destination of a short URL. So instead here we look at whether or not people are aware of the fact that the destination is hard to predict. And it is encouraging. 65% selected that it would redirect to a website with a longer link, which is accurate. 16% suggested that the website that would open is not one that was listed on the list, which is also true. And 11% selected that the company names of bit, goo, poo, and you. This is consistent since technically the site would redirect through this point. So people are aware that these do not necessarily go to where they think. Complex URLs involve two company names. So if you look at the bottom three, we're looking at a case where one of the company names is on one side of the slash and the other one is inside the path name. This was to kind of figure out whether or not people could differentiate the use of the slash character within a domain and understanding that the domain is on the left and that the path is on the right and that the destination will be on the left. So in this case, Twitter, Facebook, and Facebook. The top one is a much more complicated URL. It uses the username component of the URL specification, which is not very well known, but we include it anyway just to, well, add something a bit more challenging. The correct answer is this will go to Google, not to Facebook. So when we look at their answers to each of these, what you're looking at is all four URLs along the left, and then all the different potential answers.